Now let's move on to the Q&A session. Moderating the session will be Ms. Aarthi Sivanandh. To introduce the moderator, I now call upon Mr. Dayanidhi.
Ms. Aarthi Sivanandh is a recognized name in the Chennai mergers and acquisitions legal market and is present on some notable corporate transactions. Her expertise is called for in private wealth matters, corporate governance, and board advisory. With over 22 years of working in the pan-India corporate law markets, she focuses her practice on the full spectrum of corporate transaction matters, including M&A, private equity matters, and cross-border transactions. She heads the Taiwan desk for AZB and Partners, where she serves as a senior partner. Combining her time and experience of working in the US and India, she is passionate about deal making and believes the role of culture in deal making is important. She is recognized constantly by international legal institutions, ranking India transactions lawyers who have a wide exposure to domestic and international markets. Thank you very much, Ms. Aarthi, for agreeing to moderate this session. Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. And we've heard our three wonderful speakers in the earlier part of this evening. So I'll try and keep my questions really short so they have time and you have time for Q&A as well. In no particular order, and since I'm a lawyer, I have to start with a disclaimer that I've been saying, I come in peace, I represent no one. And I have a few questions that are delving into some of the broader topics that each of you have already spoken about. But I'll jump into it right away and ask Mr. Banmali my first question in saying that, the global semiconductor market that you spoke about, and specifically with respect to India, is already at about 600 billion and soon to be 1 trillion in 2024. And I believe that nations that control their destiny with chips and technology, as we've all probably read Chips War, one of the recent books around it, allude to the fact that we need a whole host of things to actually lead over there. And the Tata House has obviously made a very huge commitment to enter into all the three value chains in the whole semiconductor business. You've gone into electronic manufacturing, you've been introduced yourself into semiconductor fab as well as OSAT. And it's very unique for an Indian corporate to get into all three, let alone at different points of time, but also at the same time. So a brave and beautiful and bold move. So congratulations on that. But would you like to speak a little bit about, therefore the opportunity ahead for India and the value creation, therefore, as a result of that, but also maybe highlight one or two challenges in doing that.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. I'll be really brief. I think the EMS opportunity came up. In fact, we've been at that the first. It came up about 4 years ago during COVID, when I think people realized that they had to move away from China. And it was quite a desperate move by one of the leading manufacturers to say that, look here, we need to do this with urgency. And I think their point was, we're going all in. So are you willing first to go all in? It will require you to make substantial investments. It will require you to learn. It will require you to meet our exacting global standards. But you know that once you get there, then you've acquired a capability that can be used then for so many other things. I must say we're about 4 years down that journey. We've learned a lot. I think we are today well set to take on even more opportunities and are doing reasonably well as far as the EMS side is concerned. And I want to emphasize the fact that this is one sector that can offer tremendous jobs, well-paying jobs, good jobs, build capability and skills, and therefore it is something that we should embrace with all our hearts. As far as semiconductors is concerned, clearly we in India do not have the technology. And therefore we are going to either have to buy it or we have to partner with it, maybe a combination of both. And we've decided therefore to partner and to buy. It is expensive, there is no doubt about it. It will take some time, but as I said earlier, somebody's got to do it, and therefore we've decided to get it done. The most critical element over here is going to be talent. because we really don't have much of talent available within the country who understand semiconductors and how do you get into manufacturing. But there is a large diaspora of Indian origin people that are fortunately doing a number of things in this business worldwide, and many of them want to come back. So we are trying to make sure that we are able to get that talent back, and at the same time, start up the whole learning piece as well that is in the country. So listen, we feel very good. We know it's a bold bet, but I think that is something that has to be taken, and we would urge more such bets that are made in the country.
And just taking off from what Mr. Banmali said, Ambassador Gokhale, my question is to you. Am I audible actually right at the end? Okay. So there is, like he alluded, there is some school of thought that despite Indians being, ingenious, smart, our talent spread across the globe, and we can build anything at any point of time, some of the key technologies that we're talking about, right, the PCB manufacturing, building electronic components, and so on, reside in China, Taiwan, and that side of the world. And we've seen examples, at least as an occupational hazard, I've seen, several joint ventures and M&As fail when we try to do that with, China, some of them. So would you want to speak a little bit on how is this going to play a role in accelerating India's foray into electronic manufacturing, given, majority of the talent lies somewhere else? There is a time gap for us to make that ramp up to do that. And given the geopolitical situation, that may not be so easy and so quick. So how do we go past that and get where we want?
Yeah. I think Mr. Agarwala already outlined a crucial point, which is that if you can convince many of the major manufacturers to come to India, the supply chains will follow because they have to relocate to where the main manufacturer is. But the other point I think he made, which went unnoticed, was that we need to massively invest in education. Yeah. China's real economic miracle happened not because it opened markets to foreign direct investment, but because between 1990 and 2010, the spending on education, primary, secondary, and tertiary, was simply phenomenal. And it is this which led to R&D, which in turn has created that the miracle of the Chinese economy. Just one telling fact that it's an anecdotal thing. I was in Boston in October, and I happened to sit next to a gentleman who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2005. And he told me that in his labs, he's in quantum computing, in his labs until 2000, the overwhelming majority of students were from India. But after 2000, he says Indian students have virtually disappeared from basic sciences. They're either going into management or they're going into applied sciences. Now, I think there's something wrong if in India you're not able to first create scientific talent and then to retain it. So I think that's really something that we will need to do. Apart from that, I think, as Mr. Agarwal says, and Mr. Munot also, most of the other elements are already present, but really education and skills urgently require upgrading. And since you talk of Taiwan, I lived there for 4 years. And the head of the company which built the high-speed rail there, which was also working on the metro line in Delhi, told me that I don't know why you talk of the demographic dividend. I can't find enough skilled people to build the metro line in Delhi. So I think that tells us that the demographic dividend in the skill capability, there is a gap there as well.
And we've also heard of, again, anecdotally, that TSMC, for example, from Taiwan, I mean, during my time there, I learned this fact, that they still had all these problems in executing a lot of the work that they had taken on in the US. So it's not essentially just the IP that TSMC had, but where they could execute in geographies also placed a challenge. In that context, do you see India, opening its doors, to a closer partnership with companies like that? And is it all on the private sector, or is there something the government should be doing more to enhance that?
Well, government can always do more, but I think it's done enough to create an enabling framework now for foreign direct investment to come in and for Indian companies to build partnerships. I think the problem, I mean, I'm talking now from my own experience. I was ambassador in Germany, and German investment is very significant in India. The problem is not policy, it is hand-holding at the last stage. And this is where China still trumps us, which is that when they go down to the state and the district level, the registration of companies, the water, the electricity, the labor laws, unless you have somebody hand-holding the company and doing these last-mile things for them, they still tend to think India is a difficult place to invest. Now, there are states in India which are very good at this, and I don't need to name them, I think it's fairly obvious. But by and large, China has been better at doing it. And we have to therefore, I think from the government side, understand that simply changing policy in Delhi without actually seeing that it is implemented at the state level is not enough. But I think industry also needs to recognize that they have to, partner with foreign companies and take that big bet.
Thank you. And we'll just shift from the geopolitical and international and semis to Mr. Munot. My question to you is, when I try to invest in a mutual fund, very simple question, and we go online. Today, the first throw-ups from Google is all of the fintech platforms, right? So you don't see, I won't name some of the big equity platforms or AMCs, but you see that, a Grow or a Paytm Money and, all of these fintechs have risen so phenomenally over, less than a decade. We've had, Angel One, for example, has about 1.5 million SIP plans, right, available already. That's almost half the number of the overall market. So that's how central, I believe, from my perspective, that fintechs have become important in the 600 and odd billion mutual fund industry that we have. So how are you as an established player sitting there and understanding how these new age companies are either adding to the froth or, they are rising with, the boats that are rising them along with the tide, as they say. And the regulator at every point is trying to check. So you just had the stress test that came out 2 days ago that affects everyone because there are a small fraud. So you have this regulatory push and pull in the equities market. And while, I agree with all the good stuff on the slides, how is that affecting not the retail investors, but how is it affecting the financial players in that field? So,
no, good. I mean, as long as you come through a fintech or you go through an HDFC bank branch or you come through our friends from 361, as long as you invest in HDFC mutual fund, you are in good hand. you will create wealth. I mean, starting from the last point you mentioned about this disclosure on a small and mid cap, I think the one thing we have to appreciate about our regulators is that I think they've always taken the level of prudence or let's say the transparency to a level which you don't see in most of the other countries. The kind of disclosures we make in India's mutual funds, or for that matter, even in some of the other spheres of financial services, but more true for the mutual funds, is absolutely exceptional. And we've always believed that over a period of time, in a country which is where it's so underpenetrated, where people don't invest in equities or don't invest in mutual funds, and we have a long way to go, a higher transparency or better transparency is good for us. And your other point was like, how you look at the overall fintech. I must say this, that I think in some manner, some of us talked about the healthcare, what India can do, or manufacturing, as you said, that for 30 years it's been around 15, 16, but you don't know. For things there are tipping point, and then some of the other things just fall in place. I think the fintech is something like that. So in a country where people are financially underserved, till few years back, my driver from UP, if he had to send money to his hometown or to family, the only way was in Mumbai to go to a VT or a Dadar station and find someone he can think of who's going to that village so that he can give that cash, so that cash when he reaches there. And today, I mean, everybody is on UPI. You can buy a 10 rupee coriander with the UPI, how we have kind of like transformed. So in a country which is financially underserved, but technologically enabled or tech aware, or I would say actually very tech enlightened population. I think our adoption of technology has been far better than most of the other countries, I mean, at masses. I think it's a great combination for anybody to feel very bullish about the prospects, right? You have a population which is financially underserved, and you on the other side, the technology is making it easier and easier to serve them. Traditional players are very, very well placed, but there would be opportunities for many other players to kind of play a role in that and ensuring that whether it's financialization of savings, whether it's overall digitalization of finance, we are able to make that move.
And, now that you say, of course, that technology has, seeped down to the smallest of retail investors, is SEBI, our favorite friend, treating, all of this with a pinch of salt and trying to over-regulate? Or what do you think should be, from a regulatory perspective, the way to continue to grow this segment? Rather than come down very heavily every few weeks with new regulations and so on. So how do you see regulatory space intertwined? Because one of the points Mr. Gokhale also made during his talk was, while we have all the infrastructure and the basics and fundamentals, a lot of it is regulatory as well. When do you push and pull? When do you clamp down? And so on. And is that something that hurts or enhances or supports specifically mutual fund industry? Because over the last 8 to 9 years, you've had a great run of all domestic investors, dumping all savings into mutual funds. So it's an unparalleled sort of run that the mutual fund market has had. So,
first of all, that's not true that all investors dumping all the money into the mutual funds.
80%.
If you look at India's households balance sheet, it's around $10 trillion. And of that $10 trillion look like this: 50% in real estate, 15% in gold, 15% in bank deposits, equities 4.8 or 4.9%. And it was 2.4% or so 10 years back. So the allocation of Indian households to equity as an asset class is less than 5%. So we have a long way to go. In fact, when people ask about that, you give so much a bullish story about India, what are the risks? I mean, of course, there are many risks that both of them have highlighted. The one risk I would say is, because people don't invest in risk assets, over the next 25 years, as we become, let's say, $20-25 trillion economy, which is almost same as where the US is currently. But by that time, the per capita GDP won't still be that high. If Indians don't start investing now in risk assets, we will have a great retirement challenge. The government will do a phenomenal job. It's doing a phenomenal job. Will do even more phenomenally over the next several years in giving this basic social security, taking care of, a good living condition, quality of living will get improved. All this rice and wheat and whatever, the tap water and all of that. But I don't think the Indian fiscal will be in a situation where they can pay for let's say, the monthly expenses of the retirees for 30-40 years. And longevity is increasing. I have a strong view that I think if we live for another 10-15 years, the probability is that average life expectancy is going to go up very substantially. So that means that the people who are in 30s, 40s, they have to save in next 20 years because they will need those savings to live for 30, 40, 50 years. And in that case, I think what policymakers need to do is ensure that over the next couple, and we have a very short window, these are 20-25 years. You see buses burning in Champs-Élysées in Paris. You see, even in UK, the discussion about, the older generation versus the newer generation. In US, the richest country in the world for last 70, 80 years, there'll be millions of people who won't be able to meet their retirement security, and they have 401k for more than 50 years, even after that. So how on earth we are going to secure retirement of large millions of Indians? So we take pride that we are the youngest country in the world in terms of our median age, but we'll also have a very large number of old people as well after 25 years, and the work has to start now. And that's why I would give credit to the policymakers that if they ensure that the product is such that people can trust for their life savings, where they can trust the market, trust the power of institutions and the markets, that it will do good to them over a period of time, and we will grow their wealth for them. Every decision of or every step of the regulator should be looked at from that lens. So at times we see that nobody in the world is doing this. Why are we coming with this regulation? But in SEBI's preamble, they have market development, market regulation, investor protection. And I think one of these boxes or all three boxes or two of them get ticked, I think that should be good for us.
Thank you. With that, I'll come back to Mr. Banmali and Mr. Gokhale. Both of you spoke about artificial intelligence and the role, it's going to have on countries adopting it. Given restrictions are getting imposed across the board on AI, from hardware and chips to software and data, it's clear we are heading to sort of a dual AI world, if you will, because the Western world continues to share technology, collaborating on policy, regulations, etc. And you have, China and Russia on the other side, presumably doing the same. And we have a wall between all of these countries. So while you can have, laws and regulations for behavior, you can't have it so much for technology that's flowing so freely between these nations. So do you agree that we are sort of headed there, where there is walled ways of working with AI between companies, and is that going to hurt India? Or rather, what are the implications for India with respect to AI and technology that will not necessarily be shared between countries because of geopolitical reasons?
Well, I'm not a great expert on AI, I must admit. But the one thing we have not been good at, and we have to admit this frankly, is that we have not been good at rule setting and rule making where international public goods are concerned. We are always last responders, or we are sort of passive participants in any major negotiations that have set up world bodies on trade or on technology or on the economy. And I really think that in the coming 10 years, the challenge for Indian diplomacy is how we can be rule setters rather than simply rule followers. I think that really is the challenge for Indian diplomacy. That means our diplomats have to change. We can't be generalists anymore. Number one, I think you have to specialize. But more important than that is two other elements which are missing from diplomacy have to come. You have to have a strong cadre of people who understand international law. Whenever we negotiate with many delegations in Europe, there are lawyers sitting in on those delegations, but our delegation never includes a lawyer. The other is we have to have domain expertise on technology. Generalists cannot negotiate AI rules or quantum computing rules or blockchain technology rules, which means that you have to bring about a synergy between government and technical and legal experts, something which is still an exception in government. Government thinks it knows everything. You don't need lawyers and scientific experts. I think that has to change. If it doesn't change, we are going to be exactly what we are doing, which is somebody else will set the rules and we have to follow it.
Ms. Munot, would you like to comment on that as well from a private sector perspective?
Sure. Again, I'm not an expert on AI or etc., but I'd and obviously it's a very complex subject. I think Mr. Gokhale really articulated very well the challenges around regulation and countries and so on. But let me just break it up into two or three broad pieces that we need to understand. One is just around, even before you come to AI, just around data and privacy of data. And we don't have a common understanding across the world on what does that mean, how should we follow it. We in India have a certain view on it. And I think, as was discussed earlier, it is important that we value our data, we protect our data, and we make sure that there is no snooping that happens on our data, which means that we need to have our own indigenous technologies that are developed to handle and manage all the hardware that deals with all the data. I think that is really important. The second, as far as AI, listen, just as a user of all of this, I'd rather look at what is the benefit that we can maximize by using AI. And I go back to my fundamental point in just getting some basics through, like education and healthcare. And can we make it more affordable? Can we make it more accessible? And can we really drill that down so that it fulfills some of the very basic needs that at least our country and the people of our country they really have. I think that to me is going to be extremely crucial, and that is perhaps what we should be focused on. The last point to just make is we kind of gloss over the impact it will have on jobs. The fact remains it will have some impact. And I think we need to maybe study that further. The transition of people from whom AI kind of takes away jobs, what happens to them and so on and so forth, is perhaps that something needs to be looked into in greater detail.
Thank you. And I think we'll have the last question over here, and that I'm tossing that back to Mr. Gokhale to say, you know, do we see, given your time in China and Taiwan as well, do we see the China versus India as a zero-sum game? Is there a scenario where, you know, for want of a better word, we are frenemies in terms of saying, you know, both are large markets for each other, from exports point of view as well as software and technology point of view and people. China is big in manufacturing, India is trying to get there, but we've positioned ourselves as a software and services player. So is there a way we can still continue to benefit from each other, one? And two, because of the Western perception of how China now plays, is there a different way to reimagine the global South or, you know, India-Taiwan relationships? So if you can just comment on that. And sorry, it was not the last question. And the other question, I'll leave it with Mr. Banmali, so you both can go back to back, is Mr. Banmali, do you see, you know, the government's push to create self-sufficiency in defense hardware? Do you realistically see us producing, you know, anything and everything from bullets to jet engines? So I'll let Mr. Gokhale go and then.
I would say that India-China relations are not a zero-sum game. We've coexisted for several centuries as major economies, and there is no reason why we can't coexist. Actually, the zero-sum game that both India and China are playing are with the West. Because ultimately, as you rise, you take somebody's share. We are not going to take China's share, nor is China taking our share. We are both taking the share of the West. So I think we have to be prepared for the West to do to us by 2035 or 2040 what they're doing for China or to China today. Now, the big challenge is how do you overcome decades of suspicion and mistrust to build a common approach unitedly and collectively to deal with the other side, that is the West. And that is something which I regret has become more difficult because China made a strategic mistake in 2020. You know, before 2020, the average Indian citizen below the age of 35, if you asked her or him what they thought about China, 90% would have shown admiration for that country. Look at the roads, the high-speed trains, the Xiaomi telephones, and so on. 2020 has changed that. Public opinion in India sees China as an adversary. I mean those below 35. That's deepened mistrust. And you know, where public opinion changes, the government's flexibility gets reduced. So the real challenge for us is how do you overcome that distrust? How do you rebuild a relationship again? Because ultimately, it's only when the two of us stand together that both of us will benefit. At the end of it, otherwise, the West will seek to maintain its dominance and do what it takes to ensure that India and China do not rise beyond a point.
On as far as defense is concerned in Suman. So again, I mean, like electronics, I'd say defense is another, we spend what, more than 70, 80 billion a year on procuring capital goods in defense. It's a very important area for us. And I think nobody can argue that the more self-sufficient we are in terms of making ourselves whatever we need is the way to go. But a couple of other things as well. First, a lot of technology that gets developed starts with defense. You look at space, you look at anything sophisticated in electronics, you look at control systems, you look at anything, aviation, it starts with defense. And then maybe it percolates down to other areas that have commercial use. It's for that, also for that reason that we should be at the cutting edge of defense technology. Now, we don't have the technology, so we will need to partner. Work with countries, as Mr. Gokhale said, who are friendly and so on. But the more important thing is that we need to be then ready to absorb the technology when we receive it. We can't be perpetually dependent on technology for version after version. It's one thing to get the technology once, but after that, we need to have the ability to take upon it further. At the moment, I dare say, we do not. We keep waiting for the next version to come in and so on. And it goes back to the point that Mr. Gokhale mentioned. How many PhDs do we produce in electronics? How many PhDs do we produce in material sciences and so on and so forth? And you will find that the numbers are in single digits or at best in double digits. This is not going to be enough to fulfill the ambition that we have of where we want to get as a major technology powerhouse. And the same applies to the people who are working on the shop floor, etc. as well. But clearly it's a need, and I sincerely think that we should be working at it. The last point I'd make, the defense procurement process certainly still needs further improvement. You can't take 10 years or 15 years to make a decision on what aircraft to buy. The so-called Tejas that we talk about today has taken 35 years to develop. That is not the time frame in which we can be self-sufficient in defense. We need to kind of speed things up and do things much faster.
Thank you. And this is the last question to Mr. Navneet, and we'll allow the audience to interact with the speakers during dinner. So, but the last question to you would be, what are the major risks you see in the market from a near to medium term perspective?
I think the world is a fragile place. I think, the four most dangerous words in investments are this time is different. But I genuinely believe this time is different. I think the 40-year peace dividend is behind us. We were an amazing generation. I mean, we were so lucky that post-1980, we lived in the most peaceful era in the human history. I think that's behind us. The world is looking really fragile. The 40-year or maybe 30 years of, the globalization and its fruits, in many ways, I think the way it created prosperity for the world, the way it kept inflation lower because China and Vietnam and all of them, or Mexico exported goods cheaper and cheaper. Countries like India, Philippines exported services cheaper and cheaper, that kept inflation lower and interest rate lower. I think that is kind of like reversing. The climate change, that's a big risk. So some of these things I think make you a little worried. But honestly, if you ask, and these are like known or known unknown, as the famous defense secretary in US said, that it's the unknown that really hits you. That unknown I think of is basically the complacency. You couldn't predict a 9/11. You couldn't predict a global financial crisis. You couldn't predict a COVID. You couldn't really predict a Russia-Ukraine war. It's very difficult. But the known unknown is, I would say, complacency. The risk in India I see in this 25 years is it's any point in time we get complacent. We have a lot of hard work to do. This is like, we are at where US was in 40s, or UK was in 50s, Japan was in 60s, Korea, Taiwan in 80s, or let's say China in 2000. From $2,500 in a democratic society, in such a multi-ethnic and in a complex country, there's a lot of hard work that all of us need to put. And I think any complacency, whether among the policymakers, whether in business, whether in parts of society, can kind of derail us. That is something that we need to remain very worried that there's a lot of hard work. At no point in time we should start thumping our chests that we have arrived, because whatever we talked about PLI so much, but I'm sure he would know far more than me, but there are a lot of other countries who are also preparing for that opportunity, right? So it's not for only ours to grab. We have to really work continuously harder than others.
Thank you to all the panelists. I'm sure we can keep going because such interesting perspectives and depth of knowledge. Thank you very much. And I'll invite the audience to meet with them at dinner. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aarthi. This is a fascinating conversation. Please bear with me for 2 more minutes. I would like to request 2 members of our board, Mr. Mahalingam and Mr. Swami, to just give them a little gift as a token of our thank you. You'll see we have branded that as well, so we don't let you go anywhere without our logo. So thank you so much. As I was my husband was saying we should watch this conversation again on YouTube to see the nuances, and hopefully my children and the next generation will also watch it to see how much depth there was in this conversation. Wonderful. Thank you so much.